Now, here is a quick summary of what you might say were the central messages of the 4 assessment reports that we brought out. 1990 was the first assessment report, which said unequivocal detection, not likely for a decade, because climate science was still quite new at that point of time. And therefore, we made some very cautious statements. The second assessment report came out in 95, which said the balance of evidence suggests discernible human influence. The third assessment report essentially put the probability of the human impact on changing the climate at about 2 out of 3. That means 2/3 probability. But the fourth assessment report came out with the probability of 90% or more linking human actions with climate change which was happening. So our knowledge and our degree of confidence in linking human actions and climate change has grown over this period of time. Therefore, it is important for us to take action. And if you look at this diagram, which shows temperature changes since the beginning of industrialization, you would see that there are fluctuations in average global temperature. And this is the result of both human as well as natural changes which have taken place. But what is significant is the fact that in the last 5 or 6 decades, you see a very sharp increase and a very steady increase. Therefore, if you were to draw a line across this plot, you would find that temperature increase in the 20th century has been about 0.4 degrees Celsius over the past 100 years. But if you look at the last 50 years, the slope is much steeper, which tells you that temperature increase has been much faster in this period. And when we brought out this report in 2007, we said that 11 of the last 12 years rank among the 12 warmest years in the instrumental record of global surface temperature. Excuse me. The first assessment report had a major impact in defining the content of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The second one was largely instrumental in providing knowledge for the Kyoto Protocol. The third one focused largely on impacts and adaptation. And the fourth assessment report built a very strong basis in terms of knowledge for a post-Kyoto agreement and long-term cooperative action. Now, the document that we got in Rio +20 had 3 specific paragraphs which deal with climate change. And these are placed before you, so I'm not going to read them out in the interest of time. But paragraph 190, it says, we reaffirm that climate change is one of the greatest challenges of our time, and we express profound alarm that emissions of greenhouse gases continue to rise globally. We are deeply concerned that all countries are vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change and are already experiencing increasing impacts, threatening food security and efforts to eradicate poverty and achieve sustainable development. So climate change is clearly a factor in being able to reach a pattern of sustainable development. If the impacts of climate change continue unabated, unmitigated, then clearly that would come in the way of the world being able to achieve sustainable development. And this is Article 2 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is, in a sense, the core of the UN Framework Convention. And it clearly lays down the ultimate objective of the convention as stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Now, climate science is at the heart of sustainable policy because without appropriate measures, climate change will likely exacerbate poverty and slow down economic growth in developing countries. will act as a threat multiplier, especially in the developing countries. And therefore, climate change really adds to the stresses that challenge our ability to achieve ecologic, economic, and social objectives that define sustainable development. So may I say that to ignore actions on climate change is clearly going to ignore our desire to move towards a sustainable path of development. And if you look at the implications by divisions between North and South, developed versus developing countries, then we found in our special report on extreme events that fatalities are higher in developing countries. In fact, since 1970, over 95% of natural disaster-related deaths occurred in developing countries. And therefore, you cannot possibly expect the developing countries to wipe out poverty if the impacts of climate change continue. We also found in the Rio +20 declaration that we stress the importance of stronger interlinkages among disaster risk reduction, recovery, and long-term development planning. So clearly, preventing disasters is an important part of promoting sustainable development. Our special report on extreme events and disasters found that there are limits to resilience. These would be faced when tipping points associated with social and or natural systems are exceeded, posing severe challenges to adaptation. Yes, the impacts of climate change require adapting in a determined way to those impacts. But you could reach tipping points in this, both with respect to social as well as natural systems, which would make it almost impossible to be able to adapt. And therefore, I think mitigation is absolutely essential for dealing with the challenge of climate change. We also saw in Rio, it says that we note with grave concern the significant gap between the aggregate effect of parties' mitigation pledges in terms of having a likely chance of holding the increase in global average temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Now, in the fourth assessment report, we had clearly stated that if the world has to attain this 2 degrees to 2.4 degrees stabilization of temperature, then at least cost, we would have only up to 2015 to see a peak in emissions of greenhouse gases globally, after which they must decline. Now, the heads of state and government at Rio +20 did call for the widest possible cooperation by all for an effective and appropriate international response to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. And they also talked about the nationally appropriate mitigation actions, adaptation measures, technology development and transfer, and capacity building in developing countries. And I'm very happy to see that we have Madame Ishii with us, because as the chair of GEF, the world has very high hopes on what she's going to be able to do. And we know that she's going to live up to those hopes. So my congratulations to Madame Ishii for this very important position that she is now going to occupy. This is what I said earlier. If we want to stabilize the global mean temperature between 2 to 2.5 degrees Celsius, then clearly global emissions, if we want to attain this at least cost, will have to peak no later than 2015. And delayed emissions reductions significantly constrain the opportunities to achieve lower stabilization levels and increase the risk of more severe climate change impacts. So this is clearly something that the world has to take into account very seriously, because if we delay emissions reductions, then the impacts are going to become progressively more severe in the future.